I guess we can get going. Thank you, Paul. I just could not find the source of that transmission. All right, it is Tuesday, July 7th, 2026. You're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell. And if I can last a whole hour, I will be here for a whole hour. Things are going on now that can definitely affect my longevity. Let me put it that way. In being able to continue to do this. I know I've been saying this before, but anyway, let me go on here. I thoroughly enjoyed having Harley on yesterday. I would like to have him on more often. I've invited him a couple of times, but I wasn't able to get him. I think because I had the wrong email. He's got more than one. Anyway, building on what we talked about yesterday, and what just happened with the 250th celebration of the beginning of our country and the beginning of the NATO summit today, and tucked in between these two things was this massive attack against Ukraine from Russia, the biggest attack yet. Hundreds of missiles hitting so many military targets that it looks like the Russians are finally getting off of their patient backside and getting ready to wrap this thing up. Now, if you look at the sweep of history, you see that when empires go down, the trigger is often a failed military operation, an assault of some kind that just went bad, a siege that ruined the army doing the siege rather than the siege hold, or a war that didn't turn out right. And when you draw out the import of some of today's leading current events, and you set the tasks for what has to follow the defeat of oligarchism, and empire, actually, because empires are controlled by oligarchs, you come up with, we talk about, well, we're in the middle of events. This side's going down, this side's going up. And you don't often see the pattern of the larger picture when you focus on a particular event or series of events. But the picture is, from the earliest recorded times, empires don't last. They just don't. Now, we're in a period where the empire, and I'm referring to the extended financial military Epstein cross borders elitist complex, is attempting to persist in the continuation of their empire that has always been there. It's been there for several hundred years. It's just the mask is finally coming off, and we're seeing who is behind this. And the fact that it is attempting to persist is lethal to the future of this planet. But it's in serious trouble. We used to talk about military-industrial complex, then we talked about the military-industrial congressional complex, because the military-industrial complex is hand in hand with our congressional complex, being the same, two heads of the same beast. And then all of the banking cartel complex and the lawfare complex, all of it is in serious trouble right now. And you look at the greater Israel empire that's being driven on multiple fronts against Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and then against Syria and against Iran, and so on and so on. Israel is absolutely overstretched in all directions, causing death and destruction wherever they turn their eyes toward. And then you look at this profound message from Iran. rejecting the imperial assault that came from the United States and Israel, pretty well establishing the fact that Iran has won this war, or so far. We know the United States and Israel is going to launch another attack before long. Some people are saying it could be as late as just before the midterms or after the midterms. Now, we're sitting here at the beginning of July. August, September, October, November. Midterms are only 4 months away. Yet it's not, you look at some of the elections around this country, and the Democrats aren't necessarily striking back as heavily as they thought they were going to. So I think it's still up for grabs. But you look at this message that has come out of Iran. Despite the U.S.-Israeli rounds of warfare, despite our continuing program of assassinating their leaders, the people of Iran have stood firm for their nation and their culture and their millennial-long civilization. Actually, more than 1,000 years. And up to 20 million people, that's one of the estimates that I read, up to 20 million people were in processions yesterday commemorating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was killed along with his family members by Israeli-U.S. airstrikes. And when you're in the middle of history, it's very difficult to give it always a definite name. The Dark Ages, the medieval period, the Romanesque, the Italian Renaissance, the classical period. It's hard when you're in the middle of it. It's hard to give it a name, but what you can say is this is definitely the period where the empire, meaning now I don't mean any particular empire. Sounds like I'm in a barrel with an echo. I'm sorry, guys. Thanks, Mark, for telling me that. I don't. There's nothing I can do. As long as I am doing this remotely, here I am belly aching again. You can't hear me on the broadcast. I presume I'm coming across on the stream all right. But on the K-Talk broadcast, I was just listening to a recorded show there a few minutes ago before the top of the hour. Sounded fine. The fact that you can't hear me, or there's difficult hearing me, and I'll try to get the phone closer to my mouth here, maybe this will help. But when you're in the middle of a particular historical period, like we are now, this is definitely the period where the empire, not any particular empire, just the oligarchical system that is pretty well in control of the financial future of this planet, is simply overstretching itself, because these establishments don't want to register that to fight wars to achieve your aim is a losing proposition. Hegseth's idea that we will bomb them into doing what we want isn't necessarily a winning program. Now, sometimes it can take decades before that becomes clear, but when was the last time, or when has the United States won its last war? Well, not in Vietnam, not in Afghanistan, not in Iraq, yeah, I'm all right. Thank you. I'm about kissing my smartphone here. It's so close to my mouth. Not in Iraq, not in Syria, not in Libya, not in the Ukraine, definitely not in Iran. So rather than realizing that method of trying to consolidate a world hegemonic position is not successful, our country, our leaders, our Congress simply refuses to learn anything from China. China is not using any weapons, just offering economic development, and they are making friends all over this planet. So you kind of have to ask yourself the question, Paul, why are these elites not smart enough to recognize that the only way they can compete in the economic systemic competition with China would be to do what China's doing and start making friends instead of killing innocent people and helping to develop these countries? I've given the example of what China's offering as opposed to what the United States is offering these countries over and over again. I don't need to go into it again. But given the fact that all these people have put their fortune into making profits with the war industry, their thinking is blocked to think in the direction of development rather than bombing. And when the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, I guess they call it now, is adamant about if they don't do what we want them to do, we will bomb them into doing it. I mean, he has the greatest power in all of our military, second only to the president. And so the task for all friends of humanity, for all of us who long for a world of peace, is to fill this void of morality, and as more and more people and nations reject the concept of empire. Now, there's an especially dreadful update today because I need to talk about, if you look at our history of empire, the entire electric system now has collapsed in Cuba, affecting its total population of 10 million, which is the direct result of economic warfare of nearly 7 decades against that country. The UN General Assembly is going to meet in New York today for morning and afternoon sessions called "The Necessity of Ending the Economic and Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed on the United States of America, imposed by against Cuba." And the same day, today, the annual NATO summit takes place in Turkey, convening leaders of its 32 member states to discuss more warfare and military financial complex looting. I think the task for us individually, K-Talk audience, citizens of the United States, is to get this world off the edge of the abyss and reinstall the principles of the American Revolution in the United States, and to create a John Quincy Adams foreign policy for the United States and a new security and developmental architecture for the rest of the world. Now, last night, and it's the relative aspects of saying last night when it's the opposite side of the world. Sometimes I get lost. I don't know if it's yesterday or tomorrow morning. But last night, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a statement reporting a massive overnight precision strike that had been launched against the Ukraine. This is what TASS said. Last night, in retaliation to the Kyiv regime's terrorist attacks on Russian territory, the Russian armed forces delivered a massive strike by ground-based, airborne, seaborne, long-range precision weapons and attack unmanned aerial vehicles on military-industrial enterprises, fuel and energy sites in Kyiv and the Kyiv region, and also the infrastructure of military airfields in Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Cherkasy, Chernigov, and Kyiv regions, the ministry said in a release statement last night. Now, this massive bombardment of Kyiv that they're referring to was the third one since Moscow's warning in May that it was going to make consistent and systemic strikes at enterprises of the Ukrainian defense industry in Kyiv, and to stop Kyiv's ability to attack civilian targets in Russia. So as with the bombing that happened several days ago, the night of July 1st, July 2nd, the Russian Ministry of Defense published this list of last night's the night before last targets. Among the ones in Kyiv were the drone maker Abras PT, other companies that make the UAV drone components and armor, and the USV marine drones, and the electronics and guidance system plant Kevant, and a strike on the Vizar factory in the Kyiv region, which makes and services missiles and long-range UAVs, apparently led to some spectacular secondary detonation that sent projectiles into the air that fell back down to the ground and touched off fires. The city and regional authorities reported that at least 22 civilians were killed in the strikes. Now, Russia appears to be intent on demonstrating last night on the eve of the beginning of the NATO summit today, which, of course, being in Ankara, tomorrow, today's already over with. So I'm waiting for some reports to come out of it. But the Ukraine is on a fast track to losing this war because Russia is speeding it up. Now, the strategic analyst Fyodor Lukyanov, who's an editor-in-chief of Russian Global Affairs, I've talked about him before, in an early article beginning of last week, he said the Russian side hasn't abandoned the view that unlike a completely hopeless Western Europe, Washington might still play a useful role. Well, maybe at first, but the White House must be brought back to the realization that a military victory for Russia's opponents is impossible. They can't win. Otherwise, any spirit of anchorage is going to remain nothing more than some hollow phrase, which I'm afraid it's becoming. Now, Ukraine's acting president, Zelensky, had warned 2 days ago that a major strike by Russia was expected. Zelensky said this: "Intelligence once again indicates that the Russians are preparing a new massive strike. This is typical of Putin, right after America's Independence Day and before the NATO summit in Ankara." Well, after the attack, Zelensky insisted that the NATO meeting had to come up with increased. What Zelensky wants out, let me put it this way, what Zelensky wants out of this NATO summit is increased Patriot and other missile support for the Ukraine, because not one of the 29 Russian ballistic missiles fired 2 nights ago at Kyiv targets were brought down. Not one of them. And Zelensky is demanding that European NATO countries hand over to the Ukraine their supplies. Thank you, Mark. I would like to initiate a listener's donation collection for you, a new speakerphone to speak into for your broadcast. I donate 20 today. Here's the problem, guys. The way I contact the radio station is through the telephone. The recording of the show, stuff like that's done through the computer. But the actual voice contact has to go through the telephone. And so, I don't know, maybe there is some way for me to hook up some better kind of a microphone to my phone, but my phone still has to contact the radio station to broadcast from the tower. Well, I'll look into it. I'll see what I can do. All right, and I don't need your donations. That's awfully sweet of you, Mark. I appreciate that. I can probably round up some The trick isn't getting a better microphone. The trick is figuring out how to hook it up to my phone and then still be able to call the radio station. But I'll see what I can do. So anyway, Zelensky is demanding that the European NATO countries hand over to the Ukraine all their PAC-3 interceptors for the Patriot and anti-missile system, because 29 of these ballistic missiles, I'm not talking about cruise missiles, I'm not talking about unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones, the ballistic missiles, the ones that go all the way up and then all the way down at incredible speed when they hit the ground. Not one of them was shot down. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that the armed forces of the Ukraine fired more than 700 drones against Russia in the past 24 hours, and a great majority of them were shot down. There were reported hits, however, on the energy facilities in Crimea and the tanker ships offshore in the Sea of Azov. And a Ukrainian drone set fire to the oil refinery in Omsk, central Siberia, 2,500 miles away from the nearest border with the Ukraine. So there's speculation that somehow the launch must have been done from a truck stationed within Russia or at least in Kazakhstan. Now, Maria Zakharova, who is the foreign ministry spokesperson, said this just the other day, as reported by TASS, quote, reports by British politician and journalist Jim Ferguson, who described the Russian leader's appearance in military uniform at the meeting as an intentional signal, Zakharova goes on, I think he's right. There have been more than enough signals of an intention to resolve these issues peacefully. All of them have been ignored by the Western relay system, which has broken down. The current signal is clear. We will finish off the terrorist neo-Nazi threat to the end and across all fronts. We are not abandoning peace, but the methods of persuasion have changed. Thought that was kind of interesting. I was going to talk a little bit about the Iran funeral, but I don't think, maybe I can come back to that. I'm not really sure I have time for that. But the NATO summit that has already started, 32 different nations, going to be meeting for 2 days at the presidential complex in the Turkish capital of Ankara. And the center of attention during those days, of course, is going to be our president. President Trump is there, who's already, kind of upset the alliance with changes in the U.S. force posture in Europe, already pulling armies out. And he's demanding absolute loyalty from NATO members and complaints that the Europeans were not helpful enough during the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. He didn't go so far as to say something like George Jr. did, you're with us or you're against us. But the theme of much of the media coverage so far that I've been able to see, and I haven't looked at it in too great a depth, is that the run-up to this summit of European leaders trying to placate Trump to keep him from bolting out of NATO, all in the name of facing the alleged Russian threat. Now, I think the most realistic comment came from Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, when he told a journalist in an interview in Moscow, expecting provocations from Kyiv regime during the NATO meeting, he said, we have to wait for the provocations and be vigilant at all times because they're expecting an attack, a big attack from the Ukraine during the summit, which only underscores the idea that there is still some fighting spirit left in the Ukraine, and that if they can demonstrate a sizable attack against Russia, and it may be going on right now for all I know, but before tomorrow evening, then maybe they can get some more tens of billions of dollars from NATO countries to support the Ukraine's offense or defense against the Russian special operation. Now, besides a meeting with Turkey's Erdogan, Trump is expected to meet with Zelensky and also the head-cutting off president of Syria, al-Shara, I guess it is, and a senior U.S. official who briefed reporters on condition of anonymity about the trip said Trump is going to meet with Zelensky tomorrow to figure out how we can end this war. Sorry. I couldn't avoid laughing at that just at the concept of Trump sitting down with Zelensky. Okay, how are we going to end this war? Volodymyr, get out my copy of The Art of the Deal, and let's figure out what we're going to do here. Well, you know how much I like analyst, commentator, and provocateur Larry Johnson. I quote him quite a bit on my show. He had a interview with the EIR, the LaRouche publication, and he talked about the reports to cut through the pro-war propaganda and spin shaping the public's assessment of the ongoing wars in Europe and Southwest Asia. He said that the danger was the wider, not wider than we think. It's wider than we are contemplating. He said, possibly including the use of nuclear weapons. He said the vulnerabilities of the Western instigators has been exposed, and their defeats open the possibility of a new strategic architecture emerging. Then he described the attempted sabotage of the Memo of Understanding to end the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran as a continuing failure to address the underestimation of Iran as an adversary back in February. And he said that the massive turnout at the funeral of the assassinated Grand Ayatollah Khamenei exposed the error in the assumption that the Iranian government was weak and unpopular and would collapse. He said, as a result of what's happened so far, Iran has been greatly strengthened. There's a shifting of alliances underway among the Gulf states, and Iran is prepared to fight, if necessary, to consolidate the gains they've made in the war so far, while the U.S. effort to sustain the war has been weakened by the shortage of fuel since the war began. He said there's a chance fighting is going to erupt again. He's not the only one to say that, of course, citing the attempt to provoke a civil war in Lebanon as an example, which he said demonstrates that the pro-war faction in our country of neocons and Zionists and their Israeli counterparts do not want the Lebanese invasion and war to stop, but they're facing serious problems. He pointed to the efforts to integrate the United States and Israeli military through passage of Section 219 of the NDAA 2026 that Harley and I were talking about yesterday as a sign of weakness, designed to get around the growing unpopularity of U.S. support for Israel by obscuring the extent of U.S. aid Israel requires to fight. Now, before the program's over, I hope to be sure that I can spend some time on that Section 219, because then you will find out who the American patriots are and who the American traitors are. Because I would say that any member of Congress that votes to integrate the U.S. Army with the Israeli Army is a traitor and deserves a traitor's end. And as for the line that Ukraine is winning and Russia is losing, Johnson laughed at this as being completely delusional, given the continuing advances made by the Russian forces and the fact that they dropped 29 ballistic missiles on Kyiv and various regions around Kyiv without one of them being shot down, especially when you compare the casualties suffered by the Ukraine to the Russians. And Russia's methodical advance is continuing, which is, of course, forcing some rather provocative language out of the NATO members about shoring up the Baltic states with deploying nuclear weapons. As you've seen, Latvia, yeah, bring us your nukes. You can store your nukes. Yes, our border is with Russia, just over the fence over there, but you can store your nukes here. How long do you think Russia will put up with that? Johnson said that could lead to a complete catastrophe. Certainly not a NATO victory. He said he believes that the end of the war in Europe is going to include the creation of a new strategic architecture, which of course will be to a large degree dictated and designed by Russia. Just as the peace architecture in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, is going to be dictated by Iran. Remember this vital fact. Before February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz was wide open. Nobody paying anything. Scores of ships, tankers, supplies, whatever else, in and out of that strait every 24 hours. And now Iran controls it. So to say that Iran is losing this war when Iran controls the strait? Well, when you look at the historical record of what happened 250 years ago, and the implication of that for today, it doesn't fill my heart with pride as much as it does hope. That there's still, because as I see the tide turning against Zionism in Israel, especially among younger people aged to whatever to 35. Now, this ongoing debate of what the true character of the United States is now, compared to what it was 250 years ago. On the surface, you have these tremendous celebrations that are taking place on the 4th. But unfortunately, the 4th was characterized by a lot of shootouts. 52 people were shot. 5 are dead at 5 different Independence Day celebrations. And in a rash of mass shootings and public shootouts, police, of course, were blaming large crowds, high temperatures, and abundant alcohol. But I think that's really just a downside of the present situation. Because this, I think it's clear that the issue, this British freakout about the American Revolution, the American colonies gaining independence, has not been forgotten by the British. I mean, they're still plotting revenge. And it occurs in the form of Chatham House. We've talked about that. Still plotting to tear the United States apart. They have Laurel Rapp, R-A-P-P, the director of U.S. and North American program of the Chatham House, basically recounting a rather amusing story that showed up in the British press. Quote, King George III spent many hours poring over military plans in a basement near Buckingham Palace, scheming how best to suppress the troublesome revolutionaries. And that basement, the rumor goes on, was located in what is now Chatham House. Now that, of course, might be something symbolic. In any case, Rapp said that Europe has to take the lead against Russia, and the U.S. has to take the lead against China, and so they should have a division of labor. This is the craziness, the insanity that these people who represent these so-called enormous think tanks are going about day to day, when in fact we should be joining hands with China and developing these underdeveloped nations, not to rape and pillage as the Western Empire has done for hundreds of years, but to develop these things, not just for the benefit of the citizens of those countries, of which there are still 600 million Africans who have no electricity. Not because there's not electricity to be given. It's because of the policies that restrict development. Now, yesterday, today, tomorrow, however the hours work between here and Ankara, this is incredibly important event taking place in Tehran, where there are reports not totally easy to recognize, but there were figures mentioned for the largest funeral procession, as I hinted at earlier, in Iran's history, basic ranging between 12 and 20 million people in the streets. I saw one report that said it was limited to 14 million. I don't know who's out there counting it. But it's very, very clear this wasn't just a funeral. And I think what really is also clear, meant as a message to the attackers against Iran, it was more than a national farewell to the Khamenei, because Iran presented itself as defiant, as unified, and determined to keep up the fight no matter what comes next. So the Iran Supreme National Security Council just posted on X, keep your eyes fixed on Iran these days, because this is the same Iran you thought you could bring to its knees just a few days ago. Now, of course, the crowds were chanting death to America, death to Israel. Some of the more, I don't want to say hardliners, maybe that's what they were calling for the assassination of Donald J. Trump. And apparently there's this report of a poet called Rasuli who was yelling over the loudspeakers, "Why is the biggest bastard in the world still alive?" And then the AP was reporting about demonstrators saying they killed our imam, we should kill their leader, Trump. So obviously this fight is not over yet. And this Iran Memorandum of Understanding, which is now being referred to as the memo, de facto dead. It's a dead letter, even if they're not publicly admitting it. Because as I mentioned yesterday with Harley, 3 times in the first 2 sections, getting out of Lebanon is mentioned. And Israel, what's his name, Netanyahu, as recently as yesterday, said they publicly to his military and to the press, we have absolutely no intention whatsoever of pulling out of Lebanon. Because the only way Israel can continue to exist, depending on how you define existence, is to be in a constant state of revolutionary war against the neighboring states. Revolutionary war isn't the right word. War of aggression against the neighboring states. Israel cannot survive another day without warfare. Why? Because they need massive amounts of money from the United States and contributing NATO nations, particularly Germany, for them to stay afloat. 30 to 40% of their population is gone. No one is investing in business in Israel because they know the next round of missiles would probably take out their business. And the only way Israel can survive right now is to continue to shoot. But ever since Rubio signed that Israeli-Lebanon government deal, which basically gives Israel the right to say, to stay where they are, until they have wiped out all of Hezbollah, this means that the whole MOU is without any substance. So there are various rumors, speculations that the fighting is going to resume very soon. Others are saying maybe after the midterms. I think it's going to happen before, but there's these unconfirmed reports yesterday from Hamas supposedly wanting to give the government in Gaza another newly to be found government body and don't disarm. So we're going to have to kind of see what that amounts to. But in any case, the situation remains a complete horror show on all fronts. The other theater of war, Ukraine, as I talked about a little bit earlier, it's so much propaganda that it's very difficult to get a true exact assessment of what's going on. But it seems that the thing is coming to a showdown, as that quote from Zakharova said that I quoted earlier. Basically, in her Telegram channel, where she said, we're going to finish off the terrorist neo-Nazi threat to the end and across all fronts. She said, we're not abandoning peace. This was a great line. We're not abandoning peace, just the method of persuasion has changed. So now there's been this massive attack on Ukrainian military targets, as I said. The Russian military, together with the armed forces of the Donbass Republic, is carrying out this operation, which just yesterday targeted all these military targets in and around Kyiv, where they destroyed an ammunition depot with weapons which were coming from the West that were containing downgraded uranium. Now, the former Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, the government, the deputy and former commander of the Azov battalion, Igor Mosachuk, in his Telegram channel said, a Russian missile has hit a munitions depot. Remember what happened when one of the Japanese airplanes at Pearl Harbor hit the Arizona? Went right through the deck into a munitions depot under the surface of that battleship. And the depictions of that explosion, of course, were all Hollywood that we've seen since. Boy, when you hit a depot with a missile, or you hit the munitions collection sitting underneath the deck of a U.S. battleship, you're going to get somewhat of the same kind of response. And so there were cluster munitions and munitions with downgraded uranium. And the Rada deputy, now this is a part of the Zelensky government, is accusing Zelensky of covering up the incident as to how horrible this was and demanding the resignation of Zelensky. The former commander of the Azov battalion, if I remember correctly, the strongest battalion at the beginning of this war 4 years ago, is demanding the resignation of Zelensky. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry put out a target list of its retaliatory long-range strikes inside Ukraine, saying that the military industrial facilities and the infrastructure was hit. I think I went over that list at the beginning of the program, but was carried out because of the terrorist attacks against the Russian civilian population. So it seems quite a massive escalation, and it may really be the determination of the Russian side to finally get off their butts and bring this conflict to an end soon militarily, because it's not going to end diplomatically, which Putin has hinted about in various comments in the recent period, that they may finally have to get serious about ending this war. Now, of course, Putin, being pushed heavily by his own brand of neocons inside the Russian military, who are sick and tired of waiting and letting this go on like a war of attrition. It could still be a hot summer in the Old Town tonight, because I mean, you can imagine with these two crisis spots of Southwest Asia and the Ukraine, that the NATO summit going on right now is going to be characterized by all kinds of wild plans coming out of different NATO members because they don't all agree. There's certainly not a monolithic bloc against Russia, against China, because several of them, even France, is now doing business deals with China. At the same time, a collection of certain spokespeople within NATO are saying NATO without Trump is going to end the Ukraine war, and that Trump and the United States needs to go fight China. As they say, you can't make this stuff up. But according to some leaks that have already come out of this NATO summit, they're trying to raise another $140 billion in military aid to the Ukraine. Now, it's also clear that you can put a lot of money into this, but that does not change the actual supply condition of both the United States and Europe, because with money alone, you can't build tanks and frigates and missiles. You need an infrastructure that will do that. Maybe one of the reasons why Volkswagen is changing one of their plants to making tanks instead of Volkswagens. But you can't just show up with $140 billion and say, all right, we need more missiles. It's not like an assembly line. It's not like the missile making, the Patriot missile making assembly line stopped when the orders stopped. We've run out of Patriots. And if you were to build a car in the garage of your home or backyard or a shop somewhere, and you were going to build a car from scratch, how long is it going to take to get the 35,000 parts that go into building a car? That's just propaganda. It's also clear that you can put a lot of money into this, but it doesn't change the actual supply condition. Now, there's a report by McKinsey saying that the European NATO members want to put together until the end of this decade an astronomical $800 billion per year into arming Ukraine from NATO nations. Now, that's a lot of money, but if you look at the reality of this, it's much more sobering, I think is the word I want to use, because the production capabilities, as I'm saying, are not there. It looks, there's this dramatic inefficiency among other reasons, but first of all, unlike the Russian economy, which has been changed into a war economy over the last 4 years, that hasn't occurred the same way in Europe, and it certainly hasn't occurred that way here in America. As many people like McGregor talk about how we have just run our own military supplies down to almost nothing. In fact, the comment has been made a few times that were America to be attacked, we couldn't last 2 weeks in defending with heavy armament. So in Europe, you have the additional problem that you have a lot more fragmentation. Here you've got the monolithic bloc in America controlled by the Zionist regime inside controlling your Congress. It's like one voice. In Europe, you've got all of these different voices, some of them getting together and saying, yeah, let's kill the Russians. At the same time, they're doing business deals with Russia and China. So there's all these parallel national programs going on in Europe for tanks and fighter jets and artillery programs, but almost every country has their own production facility, which means that there is massive logistical chaos and a lack of compatibility because they're all going in different directions. In a lot of cases, it's a bunch of small suppliers who are very specialized, like decades or centuries-long family-led craftsmanship, or industrial firms have neither their own capital left or credit worthiness for larger operations, because just as British insurance companies are not insuring ships in the Persian Gulf anymore, there are a lot of businesses not just in the Ukraine, but in Germany, war-making businesses that are having a very hard time getting insurance because the insurance companies believe what Putin said, that if these companies are making weapons to be delivered to Ukraine to be used against us, they are targets. Now, that's a really different situation for these industrial firms who just don't have enough money or credit worthiness or insurance coverage. And then right now there's this absolute increase of danger, as was pointed out by Ray McGovern the other day, because we're looking at a building up of a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis. Because you look at the three Baltic presidents, and then Merz has basically endorsed the idea of Lithuania to locate nuclear missiles in Lithuania. And then there are the Finns, the Finnish plans, and the Poles who want to participate in the U.S. nuclear program. It's just madness. I didn't mean to go on like this. I just got to get this off my chest. I mean, this is insane, because the whole military planning in Germany is geared towards transporting into the future for the coming war with Germany hundreds of thousands of NATO soldiers and material to the Eastern Front. And to think that Russia, under these circumstances, are just going to sit around and drink their vodka, waiting until these hundreds of thousands of NATO soldiers are actually arriving at the Eastern Front, is absolutely crazy. So these NATO nations and all the money they're trying to drum up are planning for a war which in this form is never going to take place. The only thing it's going to do is increase the war danger, and the likelihood is that Russia is going to act very, very soon with more ballistic missiles outside the borders of the Ukraine. The Russians have published their armed forces spokespeople and the foreign ministry spokesperson Zakharova. We have published the locations of 12 facilities where these weapons are being produced. And it's more likely that some of the reaction against these factories or some other situation may occur in the very short time period ahead of us. Excuse me, what am I trying to say? I'm saying that the Russian armed forces may make good on their prognostications that the targets outside of the Ukraine aren't any different than the targets inside the Ukraine when it comes to drumming up war against Russia. So I think it's noteworthy that according to recent figures, the 12 richest billionaires of the world own more wealth than the poorest half of this planet. Can you imagine that? 12 billionaires own more than half of the human population. And this is something that cannot last very long, and I think this should be obvious to everyone when I'm talking about the end of an empire. Because they want trillions. They don't want just billions, they want trillions. Well, there's a bunch of other stuff I could talk about, but we're coming towards the end of the hour. There's talk in Germany of opening up Nord Stream 1. Nord Stream 1 is still sitting there. Russia has agreed to pay to rebuild Nord Stream 2 so that Germany can once again get cheap gas from Russia. But the powers that be won't let that happen. They still have to buy expensive gas, 400 to 500% more than they were paying before from Norway and the United States, because there's other pipelines through the Baltic Sea. So when you start thinking about the question of survival of Germany and Europe, the alternative obviously is this absolute insane coalition program, which has been put out by the big three, Germany, France, and UK. And I don't know, as dismal as I probably sound this morning, I still have a lot of hope. I really do, because more and more people, not just in European nations, in our nation, more and more people are awaking to the fact that we've been sold a bill of goods. And I'm looking for my notes on a poll that was taken. Where is that thing? It's where people were asked various questions about what was the revolution about, or they would ask a question, what happened on July 4th, 1776, or various questions like that. Where was the first continental government? And what was the continental government? Surprisingly huge numbers, percentages, couldn't answer basic questions about our history. And we talked about that, Harley and I talked about that yesterday, over the lack of, we're just not taught this stuff. They don't teach these things in school anymore because they do not see the relevance. All right, what do we got here? Oh my goodness, it's the top of the hour. Well, I'm off to work here. I think I'm seeing 2 new patients today. Saw a new one yesterday. He's been hurting for 20 years with sciatic pain and gluteal pain. And right after I worked on him, he stood up and said, "Holy smoke, what did you just do?" I said, "What do you mean?" "I can walk straight." I said, "Yeah, this is just the beginning. Welcome back. Welcome back to the human race. You know, all these shots, these repeated cortisol shots that these people get all the time. Cortisol destroys the cartilage. It's one reason why continuing cortisol shots don't work, because the cartilage is worse than it was when it was causing the pain that started the cortisol shots. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. I will be back tomorrow at 8 a.m. with a health show for you. I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about, but I'll try to make it worthy of your audience attention. So keep your wits about you. It's not all over by any means. There's still a lot of hope out there, despite what I've created this morning. I just want you to know what's going on, because you're not going to hear this in mainstream media. So long for now.